Je déclare le vote.
Welcome to this meeting 29 of Agriculture and Agri-Foods. I'd like to start by a couple of reminders. Today's meeting will be in a hybrid format and proceedings are being broadcast on the House of Commons web network. The image will always be on the person speaking rather than all committee members. Of course, screenshots and photos of your screen are not permitted. And please do follow the regulations of the Board of Internal Economy. Today, we are going to be continuing our study on Bill C-234.
Witnesses here for our first panel. Joining us as an individual, Monsieur Jean Caron, professor at the University Laval by video conference. Welcome, Monsieur Caron. From Équiterre, Émile Boisseau-Bouvier, who is the climate policy analyst, also joining us by video conference. I hope I got that right, Monsieur Boisseau-Bouvier. And with the National Farmers Union, we have Glenn Wright, who is a farmer and professional engineer, also joining us by teleconference. So each of our witnesses are going to have 5 minutes. Obviously, we do have the ability in English and French. You'll see the toggle at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to allow Mr. Caron to start. You'll have up to 5 minutes, and we're going to go, and then we'll start to questions. So, Mr. Caron, over to you. The floor is yours for up to 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to the committee for inviting me to testify with you today. I'm delighted to be here. I sent to the committee 2 documents. The first is a written letter to Senator Robert Black back in the spring to do with degrading soil quality, and a second document, a PowerPoint presentation with the latest research results. I am a researcher from Laval University who's studying in this field, and what I'd like to focus on today in relation to Bill C-234, what we've observed and what we've written in this document is that farming soils in eastern Canada, well, our study focuses on Quebec, but we suspect that it's the same state of affairs in Ontario, and in some cases, heavy soils in Fraser Valley, for example, and Peace Valley. The level of compaction has reached very high levels, 30 to 90%. We don't know what the exact figures are, but based on our latest samplings in the biggest region in southwestern Quebec of maize is compaction rates of 80%. And in figure 5 of the PowerPoint presentation that I sent you, the thresholds that are being reached are at levels such that 10 to 60% of nitrogen may be lost due to denitrification. So my testimony is the following. We must ensure studies of soil quality to avoid increasing degradation and the effects of nitrogen loss, which are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. There needs to be a collaborated approach to improve soil quality. And that about sums up what I wanted to say to you today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Caron. We now have Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier. I'm sorry to mangle the pronunciation of your name, sir, but please do proceed. No worries whatsoever. At least you didn't say Emily. My name is Émile, but you didn't say Emily. So, Mr. Chair, distinguished members of the Agriculture Committee, my name is indeed Émile Boisseau-Bouvier, and I'm a climate policy analyst at Équiterre. And I'd thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss Bill C-234. As we did with my colleague on Bill C-206. A few words about Équiterre. We're an environmental NGO that founded the network of family farms in Quebec, and there is currently a technology showcase project on soil health and conservation and regenerative practices. We are working with producers, institutional buyers and decision makers on solutions to build more resilient and sustainable agriculture. Now, Équiterre also obviously has expertise on climate issues, and in recent years we've argued before the Supreme Court that carbon pricing should fall under federal jurisdiction. We believe firmly that a price signal is necessary to guide individual and collective decision-making. We're also working on the issue of fossil fuel subsidies because Canada cannot continue to be the largest provider of fossil fuel subsidies and government support in the G20 if we are to meet our climate goals. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. The crux of the matter, Bill C-234, is essentially a reiteration of former Bill 206 with clarification regarding the use of fossil fuels to heat or cool a building for housing livestock or to dry grain. However, much has changed since Bill 206 was introduced in February 2020. First, the government, with Bill C-8, is now returning the proceeds from putting a price on pollution directly to farmers in provinces subject to the federal safety net or backstop. Most importantly, Agriculture Canada has also launched the Clean Agriculture Technology Program in 2021, which provides $50 million to help farmers purchase more efficient grain dryers and replace oil and gas. This program also focuses on research and innovation, particularly in the area of green energy and energy efficiency. Ultimately, these investments will accelerate and facilitate the transition of producers away from fossil fuels. Now, you'll agree that Bill C-8, enacted last June, responds to the very real problem raised by Bill C-234 without, however, weakening the principle of carbon pricing. We encourage parliamentarians to pursue and improve on this approach rather than the one before us today. We are in favour of supporting farmers, but we cannot support the systematic erosion of carbon pricing mechanisms. The transition must begin quickly. Now, I'd like to take a moment to say that we understand that farmers are experiencing increased stress with the increasing number of extreme weather events and the current economic context. We're suggesting that we help them financially by promoting sustainable alternatives. This solution, I repeat, already exists. Now I'd like to remind you of Canada's commitments on fossil fuel subsidies. Canada committed in 2009 to phase out quote-unquote inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. It has since consistently reiterated this commitment in various international fora. Last year, the government moved up its promise to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies by 2023 instead of 2025, and 2023 is just around the corner. Today's Bill C-234 proposes to exempt new fossil fuels and activities from carbon pricing. If passed, it would artificially reduce the price of fossil fuels and increase their competitive edge. In short, it would be a new subsidy for fossil fuels, even though we are committed to eliminating fossil fuels by next year. Now, in closing, Mr. Chair, while this bill is presented as a project to help farmers, it is instead laying the groundwork for continued reliance on fossil fuels in the farming sector. It is also a bill that, as I read it, would fly in the face of Canada's domestic and international commitments on fossil fuel subsidies. Given the many advances since 2020, it would be in the best interests of the agricultural sector, its farmers and its workers for this committee to quickly consider how to promote alternatives to fossil fuel-based grain drying and building heating. We have an opportunity to help the sector transition away from fossil fuels, and we should not miss out on it. Thank you very much. We shouldn't miss the boat, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier. We'll now hand the floor over to Mr. Wright from the National Farmers Union. 5 minutes or less, please, sir.
Well, thank you for inviting the National Farmers Union to provide submissions to committee here today. My name is Glenn Wright, and I've been an active member of the National Farmers Union, or NFU, since 2017. I support my farm with off-farm income as a professional engineer for 15 years, but now as a lawyer. My wife and I operate our grain farm near Vanscoy, Saskatchewan. NFU policy positions are developed through a democratic process of discussion and debate by members at regional and national conventions. The harvest of 2019 on the prairies was referred to as the harvest from hell because nearly all grain taken from the fields was either tough or damp. There was significant grain spoilage for many producers, including my farm, and grain drying required far more energy than expected that fall. So as a result, at the 50th annual convention of the NFU in November 2019, NFU members passed a policy resolution which requested that the federal government provide a rebate of the carbon levy on farm fuel used for grain drying. NFU members could not understand why grain dryer fuel was not treated the same as tractor fuel in the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which I'll hereafter refer to as just simply the Pollution Pricing Act. But since the passing of that NFU resolution, recent changes made by Bill C-8 introduced a tax credit to return fuel charge proceeds to farming businesses where the Pollution Pricing Act federal backstop applies, so Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. The NFU believes the amendments introduced by Bill C-8 were a step in the right direction, and the NFU urges the committee to be cautious with respect to further changes proposed by Bill C-234. The NFU worries that Bill C-234 proposes to create a complete exemption for farm heating fuels, which would entirely remove the pollution pricing signal currently provided by the Pollution Pricing Act. Pollution pricing signals are important because they encourage producers to find and implement lower emission practices to heat our barns and to dry our grain. The current system, as modified by Bill C-8, is now striking a better balance as it retains the pollution pricing signal without threatening food production. The problem with Bill C-234 is that a complete exemption does nothing to encourage clean technology and low emissions alternatives. The exemption proposed by Bill C-234 may have been more sensible when the Pollution Pricing Act was first drafted, but it becomes less appropriate as clean alternatives are available. The growing body of climate science information regarding dangerous climate change requires an urgent policy response. In the context of Canadian agriculture and Bill C-234, the following points must be considered. Number one, that greenhouse gas pollution must be reduced as fast as possible. There are no easy, cost-free ways to accomplish this task. In our capitalist market-based economy, pollution price signals are important for all players, including farmers. Number two, adequate supplies of food must be maintained. The Pollution Pricing Act reflected this and exempted most farm-used fuel from pollution pricing. And number three, the NFU was disappointed that farm-used grain drying fuel was not included as farm-used fuel in the Pollution Pricing Act. Bill C-8 has improved the situation regarding fuel used for grain drying while still providing some pricing signal to reflect the cost of ongoing pollution. The NFU recommends the government continue to assist farmers to transition to better practices by providing incentives for farmers to purchase more efficient grain dryers and improve livestock facilities. And also to continue using the Pollution Pricing Act to provide price signals for farmers regarding the cost of pollution where possible. Specifically with respect to Bill C-234, the NFU recommends that this committee amend Bill C-234 to include a sunset clause for the exemption, which would treat grain drying and barn heating fuel as farm-used fuel. The sunset period would provide time for clean grain drying technologies to mature and provide time for farmers to retrofit farm buildings with better insulation and heating systems to decrease greenhouse gas emissions from their farms. Subject to any questions, those are our submissions from the NFU today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. So, colleagues, that concludes the opening remarks from our panelists. We're going to now move to questions. We do have the ability to expand for a few minutes, so I intended to use the full hour for the first panel and the full hour for the second. Donc, nous avons Monsieur Le.
We have Mr. Lehoux for 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to the members of the panel for being here today. My question is for Mr. Caron, and we understand that there's a lot of impacts due to soil compaction, and you've asked there to be analyses across Canada. There have been cutbacks into budgets in the past because there have been some studies conducted. So my first question is do we need to further support research on soil compaction? Well, yes, evidently we do. And the thrust of my remarks was that, yes, taxing nitrogen to reduce its use is one thing, but the more compact soils are, the greater the use of nitrogen fertilizer will be. And this is due to the loss of nitrogen in the absence of oxygen in the soil, which results in compaction. So there has been no effort to address what you're asking in your question. Research hasn't been supported lately. There was support for research in the 80s and 90s, but then those research teams bit the dust. Well, Mr. Caron, are there other ways to go about this then? And to release funding to conduct studies in short order, because obviously we're facing time constraints here and there are no alternative solutions, are there? Now, when there are fewer tractors tilling the soil, that has its impact. But then there's a whole issue of grain drying, which is an important issue. And we don't have many other options available to us at this stage of the game. So I'd like to hear your input on that. Yes, it's important to analyse the soil, but concretely speaking, in the short term, what are the solutions available to us? Well, as far as drying grain is concerned, that's not my bailiwick. I'm not the right person to testify about that. But as far as initiatives to do with soil is concerned, research is one thing, but there's other alternatives. Rotation. Production models have changed. So farms are less and less, multitasking. So we need to go back to older systems of best practices with long-term rotation. I understand, Mr. Caron, but the problem that we're facing currently is that when we harvest those grains, there's work that needs to be done upstream, of course, but in Quebec in particular, this ties into the whole issue of drain drying, doesn't it? And that's how Bill C-234, in fact, in a sense, adds to the list of fuels that would be exempt from pricing when it comes to grain drying. This bill focuses to a large extent on that, doesn't it? So in your remarks, I'm trying to understand how a rotating harvesting processes could be helpful. I understand in the mid and long term what can be done, but what about in the short term? If there's no exemption, well, then the cost will be passed on to farmers, not only in terms of grain drying, but also the costs, which are exorbitant, of heating buildings. Well, listen, I'm afraid I'm caught a bit off guard here because, as I said, that's not my bailiwick. But, sir, Mr. Caron, when you talked about available clean tech, could you elaborate on that, please, and give us a couple of examples? I don't know what document you're referring to, sir, but what I sent to the Senate does touch on a number of clean technologies. Now, if we want to enhance efficiency and reduce the risk of compaction, well, we need equipment that's not as heavy, and we need to diversify the production model. And there needs to be a greater level of rotating crops. But one thing I can say in response to your question is, and we're observing the impacts of climate change to do with production, there are more and more extremes that we're observing on the ground. And the upshot of that is major weather events, but also an impact on drying. And we're ending up with higher costs to do with drying grains. So perhaps there's a way of diversifying production models, as Mr. Boisseau said earlier, to make agriculture practice more resilient and to reduce its susceptibility to extreme weather events. But unfortunately, over the next 10 to 15 years, our soil quality is being affected, so solutions need to be brought to the table. You have 20 seconds left, sir, so thank you very much for sticking to the time limit. Thank you, Mr. Caron. I'll now hand the floor over to Mr. Turnbull for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. I'll start with Émile Boisseau-Bouvier. Hopefully I said that right. Émile, I want to start with you. So I know in your opening remarks you expressed some concern about removing the price signal from the price on pollution within the agricultural industry. Certainly for these are on-farm fuels for grain drying and for heating and cooling. Is it your concern that if we remove that price signal, that essentially we remove the disincentive, or I should say the incentive to make the change to renewable energy on farm?
Oui, tout à fait.
Yes, indeed. If I may, I'll speak in French so that I can give you a fulsome answer. But indeed, if we take away that pricing signal, it will be a way, in a sense, to promote fossil fuels, as I said in my opening remarks. It's tantamount to subsidising fossil fuels that'll give them a competitive edge vis-à-vis the alternatives that are greener and beneficial to all of us. They are in line with Canada's environmental objectives and sustainability objectives. We need strong price signals, otherwise we won't be able to make this transition.
And is it possible to heat and cool a barn or greenhouse or fuel a grain dryer with renewable energy? So, Émile, I'll start with you, and then I'd like to ask Mr. Wright the same question.
Parfait. Donc,
Well, perfect. Yes, one of the differences between Bill C-234 and 236 is the inclusion of livestock housing. Now, there are existing solutions to phase out fossil fuels, and the government can promote the alternatives. For example, ventilation of these buildings, heat pumps, which will make the energy systems more efficient. The government can also subsidise the costs of entrance. For example, these are a number of tools that are in the hands of the government that will lead to the promotion of sustainable alternatives and the heating of buildings with renewable energy.
To hear you correctly, that there are alternatives, but the government should be or could be helping further to realize or perhaps to help finance some of those on-farm renewable energy solutions. Would you say that's true?
c'est exactement.
That you've hit the nail on the head, sir. That's exactly what I'm saying. Our farmers have environmental values that they hold dear. We need to help them to make the right choices. We need to facilitate that decision making so it's their first choice. They don't even have to have any doubt about whether or not they want to promote fossil fuels or renewable fuels. Thank you.
At the NFU there, I noticed you're a self-proclaimed environmentalist. In your bio on the NFU website, you talk about how you yourself have integrated renewable energy on farm. I think you farm, if I'm not mistaken, 750 acres in Saskatoon. Could you tell us a little bit about whether you have any experience of integrating renewable energy projects on farm, if you can speak to those solutions, please?
Yes, absolutely. I would say the issues between grain drying and building heating are two separate things with technology at different states of readiness. We certainly know how to heat and insulate buildings in a manner that reduces emissions significantly. And I've demonstrated that personally by retrofitting our farmhouse and reducing the energy consumption there by 83%. We actually made the decision to disconnect from our fossil gas connection. What farmers really need, though, is assistance to retrofit their barns and improvements to the building codes to require high-performance insulation and ventilation with heat recovery. The technology is ready now, but certainly not normalized for livestock facilities and probably only becoming mainstream in residential commercial construction as we speak. With respect to grain drying, though, the technology is in a state of maturing. We certainly can provide a heat source with heat pumps, but the problem is that grain drying needs it's an intermittent need, and it takes a very high energy demand. But certainly, if we were to decarbonize the electrical grid, I certainly see it as being very possible to use a heat pump to provide that heat source to supplement the air as you're drying your grain. It's just a matter of
Thank you very much.
Technology needs to mature.
Thank you very much. Just in view of time, I'll try and squeak one more question in there. In terms of the technology being at different stages, would you suggest that, Mr. Wright, that you talked about a sunset clause being important? Would the grain drying, the adoption of grain drying, just given the innovation and where the sector is at in terms of adoption, would you say that a sunset clause would be longer term or shorter term within that as compared to heating and cooling, which I think is being demonstrated across Canada? It's certainly with the Canada Greener Homes program, where homeowners are retrofitting their homes with air source heat pumps and solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. So could you speak to just the different timelines?
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, that probably it would make sense to have different timelines for each of these should there be an exemption. I would actually think it makes sense to have looking at it on a 5-year basis. Probably the heating of buildings may need a shorter sunset period if a sunset period is required at all. And grain drying, I think, is going to come later. So an excellent point, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Thank you, Mr. Wright. That's time. On a Monsieur Parent pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Parent, 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being here with us today. Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier, I'll start with you if I may. You said earlier that we need to keep the price signal in order to promote this clean transition, and I think most of us agree on this. But as far as grain drying is concerned, and what many witnesses have told us regarding the study on Bill C-234, is we have no economically viable solutions at this stage of the game. Are you aware of any viable solutions, economically speaking, that could replace propane in drying grain, for example? Well, thank you for your question. As Mr. Wright said just a few moments ago, there are an array of technologies that are being fine-tuned and developed as we speak. So there are options with biomass and electricity. These are technologies that are being fine-tuned right as we speak. Now, when you say we need to help farmers to make the transition, I agree with you on that note. But shouldn't we give them a little bit of a breathing room, a bit of time to adapt? You recall in Bill C-106, there was a provision, like a sunset clause, or rather a time frame for them to opt in or comply. Well, the problem with the first iteration of the pollution pricing bill, well, we shouldn't correct that mistake by introducing a new mistake, i.e. exempting fossil fuels. And I've repeated this on numerous occasions. Canada undertook to put an end to subsidising fossil fuels by 2023. And right now, listen, we're the 3rd of October 2022, so that's just around the corner. So I can't fathom how the Canadian government, if they're wanting to be coherent and consistent, can move ahead with Bill C-234 and then keep its promise regarding 2023. Well, when it comes to phasing out fossil fuels, you see that there are tax credits for major corporations. But here we're talking about farmers who would have to pay a tax on propane to dry their grain. And that the upshot of that will be an increase to the price of grain. In the short term, we just don't have any alternatives, do we? I understand the point that you're making, and we're trying to reach the same objective here, but can we find some common ground or make a compromise? So if you could take a stab at that. As far as heating buildings is concerned, are you aware of any alternatives on offer currently? Response. Well, yes, in my opening remarks, I referred to a number, as did Mr. Wright. Building heating, whether it be residential or agricultural heating, is very similar. There are a number of technologies to help reduce the reliance on fossil fuels to heat buildings, i.e. Electricity, high-efficiency thermopumps, reviewing the building code to ensure that we don't heat external elements and the outdoors. So these are the kinds of technologies that are available. They just need to be further promoted. Well, thank you. Do you believe that the government needs to be part and parcel of that transition and also give farmers a bit of leeway over the next 5 years to make that transition? Response. I think the government needs to promote those alternatives, offer financial incentives. There needs to be a pricing signal that is negative for negative solutions, i.e. use of fossil fuels, and positive signals for the use of renewables and energy efficiency, for example. Thank you. Mr. Wright, what's your input on that? Do you think that there are alternatives that we can put in place quickly when it comes to grain drying and building heating?
Well, certainly with respect to building heat, there are technologies ready to go. With respect to grain drying, it really depends on how much drying you need to do. If the grain is simply tough, we already have options, and there are many passive options that people should be using. These are grain air tubes that go in grain silos. Natural aeration with supplemental passive solar heating, I think, is a good option. It's actually what I tried to use in the Harvest from Hell of 2019. But it's when you have damp grain, when you have these very extreme conditions that you need a high energy heat source to supplement grain and dry it quickly. That might be a little bit slower to come, and it really needs decarbonization of the grid and farmers with assistance to increase their power supplies to their vineyards.
Now, as the transition is difficult, do you believe that there should be a bit of leeway for farmers to adapt without necessarily making moot or doing away with a pricing signals? Should there be a sunset clause, for example, or a phasing in period?
It's a delicate balance to be struck here, because when you have an exemption, it can take away the price signal that encourages people to act. So I think that with respect to grain drying, I've already made comments. I think that it would be appropriate to have a sunset clause, perhaps reviewed after 5 years. With respect to heating of buildings, though, I do think we already have much of the technology ready to go. What farmers need is assistance to make the capital investment.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Perron. Mr. McGregor, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing today. I think I'll start with my first question to Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier. So we are spending, of course, a lot of time talking about the bill before us, Bill C-234, but I want to talk about the Parent Act, the statute that this bill is amending, the Greenhouse Pollution Pricing Act, because when that bill was originally drafted and duly passed by the Parliament of Canada, I believe in 2018, it already includes definitions of what a qualifying farm fuel is, what an eligible farming activity is, and what eligible farming machinery is. You've been talking about how it's wrong, like C-234 is heading in the wrong direction because it's sending the wrong message. I'm just wondering, do you have an opinion on the original exemptions for farming activities that were included in the parent statute? Like, what is your opinion on the fact that farmers can buy diesel for their tractors and not have to pay a surcharge on it because there is no viable alternative? Do you have an opinion on the provisions that are already in the parent statute?
Donc, merci pour...
Well, thank you for your question. And I think this is another issue that the federal government is going to have to look more closely at. There needs to be an alignment with climate change objectives, and we need to focus on the development of new technologies to ensure that they are available in short order for our Canadian farmers. Once again, here we're going to have to strike a balance, commercially speaking. Our farmers care about the environment. they live for the environment, but we need to enable them to make choices that are consistent with their own values. So the exemptions that you referred to, well, it would be appropriate that the committee and that the parliament look at ways of promoting these alternatives and further developing them. For example, tractors.
Mr. Wright, I'd like to turn my next question to you. In my time on the Agriculture Committee now, it's been 4.5 years, I keep hearing repeatedly from farmers themselves saying that they are on the front lines of climate change. You've already referenced the harvest from hell from 2019, but look at what happened to my province of British Columbia last year. Months apart, we had wildfires and then devastating floods, which basically cut off the Port of Vancouver from the rest of the country. So I think what I'd like you to add to this conversation is maybe setting the table about the inflationary impacts of climate change, because this is sort of the crossroads we're at right now, trying to not only deal with some relief for farmers, but I think we also need to talk about the broader costs that are also incurring as a result of climate change. If you could just maybe spend maybe a minute setting that up for us as a committee.
Yes, thank you. I'll do my best. It's so overwhelming when you think about it. Farmers depend on the weather, and particularly where I'm from in the prairies, without irrigation, we really depend on adequate moisture to, water our animals and to grow our crops and to protect us from fire. We've had such dry conditions since that harvest from hell. We've been threatened with grass fires, and the high winds and dry conditions can make it downright scary to live where we are. And so my heart goes out to the people of BC and what they faced last year, certainly. There's no doubt in my mind that change is only accelerating for us with respect to our environmental conditions. And some of that is largely driven by human activity. If we don't recognize that what we're doing has consequences, I'm afraid that we're not going to have time to react. And so it behooves us to make changes right now, not only to adapt, but to mitigate and stop making the problem worse. I think that's why these changes are so urgently needed. And I would say to your former question about the price signal with respect to diesel fuel for tractors, there is a benefit for all sectors to have pricing signals. The trouble with tractors right now is we don't have an alternative, but you cannot impact what you're not tracking. So as you exempt people from any pricing signals, it prevents us from tracking it and then takes away the motivation to create those technology solutions that we desperately need.
And I appreciate your comments on the sunset clause. That's certainly what our committee explored when we reported Bill C-206 back to the House in the previous Parliament. I'm just wondering, like you already talked about the state of technology. We know it's developing. We've certainly heard from a number of witnesses in the previous Parliament that it is not yet commercially viable. On the new addition to this bill, like the property that is used for the purpose of providing heating or cooling to a building or similar structure, including those used for raising or housing livestock, I understand you may think that a sunset clause on that might be viable, but what do you think about the current language of it? Do you think it's open to too much interpretation in the number of buildings that could qualify for this?
Yes, thank you for asking me that question. I do think that the language is perhaps a little bit too vague, and I would suggest perhaps striking those two words, including those, so that it is only focused on buildings for housing livestock. I don't believe that residential and shop buildings on farms need to have an exemption, because we know already how to heat those buildings more efficiently. Passive house standards for residential homes. I turned my gas off in 2008 and retrofitted my home many years ago and reduced the energy by 83%. It's possible now. We need to incentivize farmers to make those changes, and removing the price signal would actually be a step in the wrong direction for buildings other than just the livestock handling facilities. So striking those two words to tighten up the language would be a good amendment.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Mr. Wright. We're going to go to the second round of questions, colleagues. I have Mr. Epp up for the Conservatives for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I'd like to begin with a statement from Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier, where what's contemplated under C-234 would become a de facto the subsidy for the oil and gas sector. I must admit I fail to see how the addition of a tax and then the potential removal of that tax becomes a subsidy. That's logic beyond my head, and so I just want that on the record. From what we're hearing from farmers is, grain farmers in particular, they're getting cents back on the dollar that they're spending on this carbon tax on grain drying and barn heating. So I just want to start with that on the record. I'd like to direct my first question to Mr. Wright, please. With the Greenhouse Pollution Pricing Act of 2018, the government did grant the on-farm fuel exemption. And with respect to barn heating and grain drying fuels, do you think that was an intentional policy decision or an oversight?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know that I can read the minds of the government, but it strikes me that it would probably have been an oversight more so than an intentional policy decision. But I'm really just guessing at this point.
Makes sense, and I'm trying to understand the NFU position then. With the Harvest from Hell from 2019, if I understood your testimony correctly, the NFU wrote to the government asking for a full exemption because it was an extraordinary year. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was the context that prompted that resolution. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, would the NFU position be consistent if we had a similar extraordinary year?
I think that the science and information continues to evolve and change and rapidly change. And so I think there wasn't as much of a sense of urgency to respond to the climate crisis in 2019 as there is now. And you might recall that there was a lot of court action surrounding the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. I mean, we had the premiers of many provinces, conservative premiers primarily, asking the question, is this constitutional? And I actually need to thank those premiers because they managed to do something that 40 years of environmentalism couldn't do, and that was in a matter of a year get environmental degradation declared as an existential threat to humanity by the Supreme Court. So we owe them a debt of gratitude there, I think.
To the NFU position, would your message to the Eastern Canadian corn farmers that in similar situations would require grain drying every year for their crop, what would you define as an extraordinary year similar to the NFU position in 2019, or do you think they should just suck it up?
Well, I think extraordinary years are when we have widespread conditions. It's no secret that I think C8's revisions are meant to refund pollution prices paid in aggregate back to producers. So there will be some winners and losers each year as local conditions. You might have a wetter harvest in one place than you have in another. So I think that the extreme conditions you refer to would be a widespread situation, much like the drought we experienced in Western Canada last year, which dropped yields by 35 to 40%.
Thank you. You just touched on the amount that's contemplated as rebates. So from 2019, the initial cost averages per farm on the pollution pricing for grain drying was estimated at 0.05% to 0.38% of an average Canadian farm's net operating cost, representing $210 to $774. Can you comment on whether that you feel those numbers would be accurate relative to grain farming, particularly your members across Canada? Would those costs be average representative from your members?
I would think they're fairly close, yes. We have thousands of members across Canada, and I would think that you're likely going to see higher costs on much larger farms, because in those situations you have time is not on your side. You have to push to get through all of the acres and get the harvest into the bin. So often that doesn't give you the luxury of waiting for weather conditions to dry the grain in the field somewhat. I would say that smaller farms are more likely to have some flexibility to not, run the combine every day. But I do think that on an aggregate basis, yes, those numbers are probably close.
The feedback that we're getting is that they're not close, but that probably is influenced more by commercial farm sizes versus the smaller farm sizes that are supplanted with off-farm income. You mentioned that there are commercial options available. How fast do you think the electrical grid across Canada could be put in place to support that kind of infrastructure?
I think it really depends on our ambition. If you're really focused on cost and trying to, amortize the investment we already have in much of our infrastructure, then it may take time. But I note that the Clean Electricity Standard is suggesting that the grid should be decarbonized by 2035. So we're talking about a 12-year time horizon. Certainly, to me, fuel switching from natural gas or propane to electricity, it only makes sense when you've got a decarbonized grid, because if you're just moving the smokestack emissions from your farm to where a natural gas or coal-fired power plant is, that's different.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Thank you, Mr. Epp. Now we have Ms. Taylor-Roy for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I found the discussion very interesting, and thank you, Mr. Wright, for your viewpoint as a farmer. I think this bill was initially introduced, and obviously we're all concerned about the economic welfare of our farmers and ability to manage with all the increasing costs. And Mr. Epp has spoken about extraordinary years when there are real challenges. Do you feel like these kind of exemptions or rebates should be tied to hardship? Because I noticed that in 2021, Stats Canada reported that farms had very healthy incomes, in fact, increasing revenues despite the increasing prices in inputs. So I'm wondering, given that, whether you feel that this should be somehow tied to need as opposed to a blanket exemption.
That's a good question. It's a lot like business risk management programs. I mean, when you make a policy that applies to everyone in aggregate, usually there ends up being some winners and some losers, because it doesn't work when you paint everyone with the same brush. So the suggestion you're putting forward then to address individuals or individual business farms on the basis of need is certainly another alternative that the government could look at implementing.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm also wondering about the barn drying, or the barn heating, not the grain drying. So it seems that the grain drying we need perhaps more time. But what would you suggest in terms of the barn heating for livestock agricultural purposes? Do you feel like that the alternatives are there now and that we don't need to include that in this bill, that just further assistance from the government in making the transitions would be sufficient? Or do you believe that we do need some time to make that transition still?
I believe we need some time. The problem is actually twofold. You've got the issue of new construction and you've got the issue of existing buildings. And so with respect to the new construction, what we need more than ever is to modify the building code, because the building code is woefully inadequate for our climate and not focused on energy efficiency as much as it could be. The technology is ready. With respect to existing building and infrastructure, farmers need help to do that work. It's a large undertaking to retrofit a barn to be much more airtight and insulated and have heat recovery ventilation. And there is probably going to be unique heat recovery ventilation issues that arise with dust and contaminants that are in livestock facilities that aren't seen in a commercial, a shopping mall, for instance, right? So I'm not suggesting that there's a ready silver bullet here, but we know how to do it. The engineering principles are sound, but farmers need assistance to do it.
Okay. Thank you. And for Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier, I was just wondering about your thoughts on the pricing signals. You're obviously in favor of them, but what impact do you think legislation like this, that once we have the signals in place, reverses or takes them away for a while, what impact do you think that has on the kind of farm clean tech development that's so needed in the grain drying field, for instance?
Merci pour votre question.
Well, thank you for your question. If we do away with an existing tax, well, what I can tell you is that it amounts to a subsidizing of fossil fuels. I want that to go on the record. And if we do away with it, as Bill C-234 proposes, this tax on fossil fuels, we will slow down the implementation of sustainable alternatives because they won't be able to compete from a pricing standpoint. Consumers, farmers might have the best intentions in the world, but short of a viable business case, they're not going to be able to move forward with sustainable alternatives. Therefore, we need to keep the price on carbon. We need to keep that price signal there to help consumers and farmers make the right decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. That's okay, I'll see my time then.
Okay, merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taylor-Roy and Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier. Now, welcome Mr. Lemire, who's replacing Mr. Perron at the committee. Pinch hitting, 2.5 minutes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Don't worry, Mr. Perron will return. Now, Mr. Boisseau-Bouvier, I'd like to continue with you. We agree that currently propane is perhaps the most effective fuel, but I think you can dry grain with electricity. In Quebec, well, Hydro-Quebec has already looked at some of these alternatives, including drying by way of electricity. Thanks, that's a good question, and I'm not aware of whether Quebec has special pricing for grain drying. I know that there are agreements with major industrial groups, for example, in relation to hothouses, but when it comes to grain drying, unfortunately, I can't give you an answer. Now, have you been aware of creative ways that farmers have come up with as opposed to just drying grain through propane? Well, yes. Organic material on farms is one option. It is possible to use organic materials to heat and to dry our grain, for example. That is an interesting, innovative way of drying grain that is worthy of being further explored. I think Mr. Wright would like to tack on to that. Go ahead, sir.
You know, I think there's a big parallel here with respect to drying grain, much like our fertilizer program. So in the fertilizer realm, we're talking about 4 R's: the right place, the right time, the right, placement. With respect to grain drying, this is very, very critical to focus on psychrometrics. It's all about air temperature and relative humidity, because as you're moving air through the grain, it has to be at a lower relative humidity to pull moisture out. And many farmers, I don't think, yet understand the same type of principles here, that you have to use the right air source at the right time in order to conserve your power and to have the lowest energy bill possible. So there's a lot of things we could do in terms of passive heating, passive drying, and passively collecting heat from the sun, which is a little experiment I had done on the farm, just to heat the air using the sun before it went into the aeration fan, rather than using any propane or other supplemental heat. And by doing so, I was able to lower the relative humidity of the air going through the grain. So there are options. We just haven't been thinking about them.
Merci, Monsieur Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Mr. McGregor, 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Mr. Wright, I know in the NFU has written extensively about the high input, high output farming model, and also about the state of farm debt that has gone up considerably over the last 20 years in Canadian farms. I mean, ultimately, Bill C-234 is trying to tackle one small part of basically the price inputs that farmers have. But, I've always been amazed at the ingenuity and innovation that exists out in the Canadian farming activity. And I'm just wondering, do you have any examples you can share with the committee of how farmers are really leading the way in trying to reduce their input costs? Because that's such a huge part of farming, and it really affects their balance sheet. If you could just provide some examples, I think, where you think the federal government should be doing more to build upon that kind of model that farmers are already leading with.
Yes, thank you for the question. I'm one of those farmers, I suppose, that's experimenting and trying to do everything I can to reduce my risk and to be more ready for the extreme weather that's coming with climate change. So I have been following some of the principles outlined by the NFU, largely focused on reducing my inputs. And I've been trying to incorporate biological processes to provide my fertilizer. So I view farming at the start of a third revolution. The first one was mechanization, then chemistry with fertilizers and herbicides, and now we're just getting into biological, where we're going to be looking at genetics to breed crops that might be able to fix their own nitrogen, or perhaps a perennial cereal crop so that we wouldn't have to seed it every year but continue to harvest it. So in my farm, yes, I've been employing intercropping and permanent or perennial cover, I should say, to establish nitrogen in the soil and also to prevent erosion. And I have reduced dramatically the amount of fertilizer that I'm applying, because my back of the napkin calculations show that that's the largest source of emissions on my farm. And We're also trying to minimize how many passes we make so that we can use less fuel. So necessity is certainly the mother of invention. And without pricing signals, though, farmers are still focused on yield. So if we did have a pricing signal or something about output-based performance standards for our food, all those pollution prices collected on our food should be rebated to farmers on the basis of production, so that we would encourage these more sustainable food production methods.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Colleagues, that ends our first panel here today, but on behalf of all of you, I'd like to thank our witnesses. We had, of course, appearing as an individual from the University of Laval, Monsieur Jean Caron, from Équiterre, Émile Boisseau-Bouvier, and from National Farmers Union, Glenn Wright. Thank you so much for your testimony today. Colleagues, please don't go far, because we're going to be turning things over for our second panel in just a few minutes, and we'll see you shortly.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Merci, bonne journée.
Colleagues, welcome back to the second hour. We'll get started just a few minutes late, of course, because of the vote. So our apologies to our witnesses that have had to wait just a few extra minutes. Today we have three different panelists. From the Agriculture Carbon Alliance, we have Dave Carey and Scott Ross, who both serve as co-chairs and are in the room today. So welcome back, gentlemen. Again, no strangers to this committee. From the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Jasmine Guenette, who is the Vice President of National Affairs, also in the room. Welcome, Mr. Guenette. And to Taylor Brown, who is online and can certainly answer any questions. We'll be sharing the opening remarks. And from the Producteurs de Grain de Quebec, Benoit Ligaud is the general manager. My understanding is we just have a little bit of a technical issue. We are working on getting Mr. Ligaud on the line, but I'm going to move forward and make sure that our witnesses are able to provide opening remarks. So we're going to start with the Agriculture Carbon Alliance for up to 5 minutes. Gentlemen, I'll let you two share the time. Over to you.
Thank you for the invitation to appear today on Bill C-234. My name is Dave Carey. I have the pleasure of serving as co-chair of the Agriculture Carbon Alliance, or ACA, and I'm joined today by my fellow co-chair, Scott Ross, who I'll share my time with. ACA is a first-of-its-kind coalition of 15 national farm organizations dedicated to working collaboratively on agri-environmental policy. Our membership encompasses major agriculture commodities, including seed, grains, oilseed, pulses, cattle, sheep, pork, fruit and vegetables, dairy, forage and grasslands, and poultry. Collectively, we represent more than 190,000 farm businesses. A resilient driver of our economy, Canada's primary agriculture industry contributes more than $32 billion to our GDP, while the entire agri-food industry represents another $135 billion and provides 1 in 9 Canadian jobs. The ACA was established to ensure that Canadian farmers' sustainable practices are recognized through a policy environment that maintains their competitiveness, supports their livelihoods, and leverages their critical role as stewards of the land. Bill C-234 is a key policy priority for our members, and they have been proponents of this bill since day one. To remain competitive and environmentally sustainable, farmers increasingly need capital to invest in innovations that drive efficiencies, reduce fuel use, and implement best management practices in their operations. Currently, farmers pay a carbon price for utilizing natural gas and propane for on-farm practices that are essential to food production. These practices include grain drying, heating and cooling of livestock barns and greenhouses, feed preparation and steam flaking, and irrigation. With no viable alternatives, pricing these activities does not provide the adequate signal to lower emissions from these energy sources. Bill C-234 allows farmers the capital to make the investments on farm that will drive energy efficiencies and support practices that will help the environment, including energy-efficient grain dryers, precision agriculture technologies, anaerobic digesters, and solar panels. Investments in these technologies can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and when no alternative exists, carbon surcharges pull capital away from these critical investments that would augment the sector's potential to further reduce emissions. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you. Exemptions are simply put the best option. Unfortunately, the carbon price rebates for farmers contained in Bill C-8 do not adequately respond to the breadth and variety of carbon surcharges applied to farms. C-234 would provide a complete exemption for essential activities that lack viable alternatives and leave the money in farmers' pockets to make timely investments in their operations. To support farmers in these efforts, Bill C-234 seeks to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act to extend the exemption for qualifying farm fuel to marketable natural gas and propane. We view this as tidying up exemptions that should have been in place from the get-go, when diesel and gasoline used on-farm was exempted. Farmers and ranchers are climate solutions providers, sequestering millions of tons of carbon, protecting biodiversity in grasslands, and utilizing the latest technologies to reduce fuel and water use. Agricultural production has increased significantly, while total emissions from the sector have been relatively stable for 20 years, resulting in a decrease of GHG emission intensity of 50% from 1997 to 2017. Farmers and ranchers are stewards of the land, adopting the best environmental practices whenever possible. But to be able to continue to invest in innovations, they need to remain competitive and have available working capital to do so. By adopting policies that enable producers to remain competitive, they will be able to further their investments in the sustainability of their operations, which will augment the sector's potential to further lower emissions and sequester carbon, while feeding Canadians and driving our food exports. Canada's farmers and ranchers are strong supporters of Bill C-234 and look forward to it being moved to committee stage for further discussions, debate, and analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carey and Mr. Ross. I'll now turn to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses. Monsieur Guenette.
Bonjour à tous.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasmin Guenette. I'm the Vice President of the National Affairs for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. I'd like to thank the committee for this invitation today. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business represents 95,000 members across all sectors of the economy and in all provinces. We have 6,000 members in the agricultural sector. Of course, our farmers are an invaluable asset to our country. They work tirelessly to ensure that we have the best food on our plates to feed our families. We support Bill C-234. Farmers are currently experiencing skyrocketing operating costs, such as high input and fertilizer costs. In addition to inputs and fertilizers, the main cost constraints for small business owners are number 1, fuel and energy costs, 2, insurance costs, 3, the cost of taxes and regulations. Now, with Bill C-234, elected officials have an opportunity to help our farmers deal with rising costs and help them invest in the future of their farms. For several months now, farmers' optimism has been waning and has hit new lows. In our Business Barometer survey, the agriculture sector is the least optimistic about the future. Rising costs, such as fertilizer and taxes, supply chain issues, bureaucratic and regulatory red tape, labour shortages, internet access that can be problematic in remote rural communities, all make farming very difficult.
Agriculteurs veulent protéger
Our farmers want to protect the environment. The land is their livelihood. 90% of farmers farm for personal reasons, first and foremost, and almost 2/3 do so for economic reasons as well. That's in our membership. Now, in a recent survey of our farmer members, 82% of respondents said that the federal carbon tax was having a negative impact on their business. The carbon tax reduces their financial ability to make technological investments to reduce emissions and improve the environmental performance of their farm. Our members tell us that applying the carbon tax on propane and natural gas punishes farmers for using products for which there is no widely available and affordable alternative. CFIB members support Bill C-234. We recommend that the committee support Bill 234 as well. By supporting Bill C-234, you have the opportunity to send a clear message to the agricultural sector that you are aware of the cost challenges and the key role they play. While the current federal carbon tax includes exemptions for fuels used for agricultural purposes, farmers are facing major increases, substantial increases and rising prices for propane and natural gas. This bill provides exemptions from the federal tax for propane and natural gas used, for example, for on-farm grain drying and barn heating. The exemptions in the bill are critical. Bill C-234 will help support the health and growth of Canada's agricultural sector. Thank you for your time, and we'd be pleased to take your questions. I'm joined by my colleague Taylor Brown, who'll be able to answer your questions also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guinet. We're now, Madam Clerk, do we have Mr. Legault online?
Yes, he is. If you could just ask him to turn his camera on.
Mr. Legault, there's your camera. There you are. Over to you, my friend, for up to 5 minutes.
Bonjour, je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le comité.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you for having us here today. My name is Benoît Legault. I'm the General Manager of Producteurs de Grains du Québec, which represents 9,500 producers present in all regions of Quebec who cultivate over 1 million hectares of land, generating an annual revenue of $1.5 billion and create approximately 20,000 jobs. Farm fuels represent a major expense for grain production farms in Quebec. For a farm of 200 hectares of corn and 200 hectares of soybeans, this represents or amounts to an expense of $108,000 in 2022, and this cost was $60,000 in 2019. That's an increase of nearly 80%. Propane accounts for nearly 60% of the energy cost for corn and 7% for soybeans. Propane is therefore a major energy cost item, a little over $36,000 per annum for an average farm. As you know, Quebec has a GHG policy based primarily on a cap and trade system for emission rights or a carbon market. The last bids accepted at the August 2022 auction were between $25 and $78 per tonne of carbon for an average of nearly $40 per tonne, and the federal carbon tax has been $50 per tonne since April 1st, 2022. It's set to rise to $167 per tonne in 2030. Quebec carbon credits mean a carbon cost of approximately $9,300 for a farm as described above, of which just under $3,900 is associated with propane. If the cost of carbon in Quebec follows the trend of the federal carbon tax, these carbon costs would rise to $38,800 and $16,300 respectively. Through a previous exemption, the federal government recognised that the carbon tax on farm diesel was not useful and was not the best way to achieve the desired objectives. The fact that farmers are already well engaged in good practices aimed at enhancing soil health and lowering net GHG emissions has likely contributed to this. It is still very clear to us that this tax on farm diesel could only be counterproductive in this regard. Thus, grain farmers in Quebec believe that this tax is just as counterproductive for the energy needed to dry grain. An essential operation carried out on the farm to preserve the quality of the grains and to allow the gradual and structured supply throughout the year. It must be remembered that there is no cost-effective alternative energy form or technology for drying grain, and that the tax has no effect other than to increase the cost of production, to harm the competitiveness of companies producing grains, and the ability to invest in its beneficial practices and reduce, by extension, carbon emissions. Consequently, this exemption would be very beneficial for an economic standpoint, for the grain sector and for the environment in general. I'd like to remind you that grain farmers in Quebec and Canada have been investing for several decades in improving their practices to be ever more efficient and to reduce, albeit gradually but surely, their environmental footprint. Practices have changed enormously since then. The grain farmers I represent asked me to reiterate that the sustainable production also includes an economic component, namely maintaining competitiveness, profitability and transferability to the next generation. It therefore becomes important that any regulatory framework be adjusted so as not to harm the economic reality of the farm and its ability to pursue its process of continuous improvement in agri-environmental practices. A large body of literature on the adoption of practices indicates that success in the adoption of agricultural practices depends very much on incentives and substantial investments. Grain farmers, their multi-generational heritage and their livelihood are at the forefront of the impact of climate change. They want to be part of the solution and have even committed to net zero emissions by 2050. To achieve this, research, guidance and support for structuring investments are needed. Regulations should only be used at the end of the process and should be well targeted and consistent. The imposition of a carbon tax on grain drying goes against this principle, and it becomes essential to put forward this exemption. These monetary resources lost by farms are all the less resources dedicated to practices and technologies beneficial to the environment, allowing the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. These are the main messages that Quebec grain producers have asked me to convey to you today. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Legault. Perfect with your timing.
Maintenant, nous
Now, we have Mr. Barlow for 6 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, and just a quick question. Thanks to Mr. Gannett. You said you have about 6,000 members that are involved in the ag sector. Mr. Legault, do you have an idea how many farmers your organization represents?
We represent around 9,500 growers.
Merci. Mr. Carey, the coalition, do you have an idea how many members your groups would represent? How many farmers?
Our 15 national organizations collectively represent 190,000 farm businesses.
Okay, perfect. Just to put that in context, the NFU, I think, has about 3,000 members, and many of those aren't farmers. And I just want to put that in context with when the groups that we were in this panel, and they're saying that their members are very supportive of 234. I just want to ensure that we have that in context. Mr. Carey, Mr. Ross, what we've been hearing a lot today is if there wasn't this carbon tax on grain drying and heating and cooling of barns, there would never be any innovation, technological advancements, or emissions reductions. Is that a fair statement?
I can start. I think I don't agree that would be a fair statement. I think that it's important to note that when it comes to innovation, the actual farmers that are purchasing natural gas and propane are not the innovators in that sector. They are customers, just like we would be as a household. I think that currently price signals on farm are extremely high. Farmers are already as judicious as possible with input prices, whether that's fertilizer, natural gas, propane, gas, diesel. Those are amongst their biggest costs on their books.
Yeah. Sorry, I would just characterize, the previous panel, someone alluded to a third wave of efficiency gains in our sector. I think we're actually, through a lot of what we have seen with biotechnology and are actually at a very data-driven segment of time in our industry, and that data is telling farmers very clearly, in no uncertain terms, without a carbon price or with, to reduce fuel use. And I think that price signal is very strong coming through with the prices we see on diesel and natural gas these days, regardless.
And one of my colleagues asked a couple of witnesses in the previous panel what other options are available, and there really wasn't an answer. Lots of answers like, well, things are in the works, things are happening, but that doesn't help us right now. Are there other options for other than propane and natural gas to heat barns, cool barns, or dry grain right now?
There's nothing that's scalable or viable at a macro level, at an actual level. There are niche things that you could certainly do, pelletization in small instances, but I think what we saw in the first panel was a lot of theory, and what Scott and I represent as the AC is the realities on farm. There is no viable alternatives to economically and sustainably dry your grain, heat and cool your livestock barn. Currently today, natural gas and propane are the only options. Electrification often doesn't even reach the BTUs required to dry your grain.
Yeah, I would say that's probably very similar to wood pellets, or these things, which would actually probably cause me to go back on land more often and actually increase emissions and energy use rather than decrease it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's certainly validity to some biomass digesters certainly on farm, but you would be increasing your diesel use by taking your tractor on farm, your labor costs. You then need to dry that feedstock and store it in some manner, which creates a lot of fire hazards, particularly in the prairies. And when we do look at changing weather patterns, and then you need to constantly be stoking that. Think about heating your home through your fireplace, your wood fireplace you might have in your family room. It's a labor-intensive thing, not scalable when we're looking to remain competitive, keep food costs down for Canadians, and grow our exports.
Thank you. Mr. Gannett, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Merci. One of the other argument that we've had from some witnesses is that 234 is redundant because of the Liberals' C8, the rebate, carbon tax rebate on farms. But we had Finance Canada here previous meeting, and they're saying the average farmer gets about $800 back through the rebate. Many witnesses have said that is pennies on the dollar in terms of what they're actually paying. CFIB did a study last year that showed the average farmer was paying about $45,000 in the carbon tax. Are those numbers correct, and does that show the discrepancy in what farmers would be getting back through the carbon tax rebate compared to what they're actually paying in the carbon tax?
It's from our perspective, it's better to offer offer farmers not to pay the taxes than to offer rebates. You are right that we had in a previous survey asked our member how much the carbon tax was costing them, and we had came up with the figure of $45,000. The carbon tax is extremely expensive for our farm members, and C234 would be helping our members dealing with huge cost increase on their farms, cost increase related to energy, fuel use, and other increases.
Yeah, thank you. Just one last quick question. Maybe to either of the witnesses. We see farmers have paid $34 million in a fertilizer tariff. We see the fertilizer emissions reduction policy. We see, farmers are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than any other sector in Canada. What are these costs and these policies? What's the burden that this is having on Canadian farmers? When another colleague said that the revenues are high, but it doesn't take account of the input costs.
Just quickly, and it's not because I'm trying to cut off, but we are at time, so maybe just 20 seconds, Mr. Ross.
Yeah, I will just say, one of the things we look at right now when we look at our sector is the level of farm debt, for example, farmers are taking on, and we are now exceeding, historic record levels, over $110 billion in farm debt. And when we look at what's happening with interest rates, all I can say is the debt servicing costs we're seeing on farmers are more than doubling, tripling over the last 12 months alone, and that just piles on to many of the input costs you just referenced as well. So it's a very challenging time for profitability and competitiveness in our sector.
Thank you, Mr. Russ. Thank you, Mr. Barlow. We're now going to turn to Ms. Valdez for up to 6 minutes.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining, and it's good to see some of you in person as well. So I'll start off with some questions to the Agriculture Carbon Alliance. In your opinion and through the experience of your members, what is the greatest barrier to farmers in transitioning to more sustainable technologies? Is it the cost, or do farmers not have the proper access to the technologies?
I can start. I think currently when we look at grain oilseed, it's grain drying and then heating and cooling of livestock barns. There just isn't another technology available, commercially available at any sort of scalable, economically viable level. I think when we also look at the idea around a rebate versus an exemption is that farmers during season need to be able to invest in their operations. And when they actually have more money on farm, they make more investments. But the average combine these days to harvest your crop is now over $750,000. So those are major capital investments to be made. but there's no alternative to natural gas and propane at a scalable, economically viable level.
Yeah, and I would say where those technologies are available, where there are improvements that can be made, working capital is what's needed, and that's what we hear from farmers is they need the capital to invest in those available technologies.
From your fact sheet, it mentions that Bill C-8 does not adequately respond to the breadth of surcharges that apply to farms. Can you describe how these affects farmers in your alliance and how, as we, the government, improve our price on pollution in terms of rebate to better address the needs of farmers?
I will just say, I think when we look at the impacts of carbon surcharges on farmers, it's very lumpy. It's very variable from one farm to another, and it's not a reflection of the sustainability of their practices in as much as it is a reflection of what they're producing, where they're producing it, and the extreme weather events they're facing. So many of the challenges we're talking about today with grain drying costs, heating and cooling of livestock, are necessary climate mitigation activities farmers are taking to respond to the climate conditions they're experiencing on their farms. And the challenge with a rebate is it's a blanket treatment that doesn't necessarily respond to that variability.
Yeah, I just think it's very hard to create a taxation policy like this that actually applies the sensitivities to on-farm. And farmers, as has been alluded to by my colleague at CFIB, are getting pennies on the dollar back, and that turnaround time is 18, 24 months down the road, as opposed to the working capital throughout the year that they need. During harvest for grains right now, they're running their grain dryers 24 hours a day. These are not small dryers we think as laundry being in the sub. These are sometimes 100 feet tall, 50 feet wide, running continuously for the duration of harvest, September, October, November, $20,000, $30,000 grain bills. They might get a few $100s back a year, 18 months, 24 months from now. It does not allow them to make any adjustments on farm when they need to during the year where cash is more difficult to come by.
You spoke about funding and that farmers really need funding. So how can we improve on the on-farm climate action fund? Any feedback you have there that can assist farmers, that would be greatly appreciated.
I would say, the biggest thing is flexibility and ensuring that funding is available to emerging technologies and new innovations as they come online and is not overly prescriptive to ensure that you're really enabling farmers to be decision makers because they are fundamentally very focused on on-farm efficiency, improving their environmental footprint. And so ensuring that you're working with partners who have strong relationships and networks in the industry to help spread word of mouth around new technologies and ensuring funding is flexible to accommodate the diversity of technologies we see coming online.
Thank you. If I have some time, I'll continue my questions with Mr. Legault. So I understand that farmers, they've had difficulties with climate change, rising prices, global instability. Can you share how grain farmers could benefit from the exemption in fuel charge for propane and natural gas?
Well, I don't know if your question addressed, I'll do it in French. It's going to be easier for me. Votre question.
So your question is about Quebec, I imagine. Now, as you're aware, in Quebec, we have a particular or specific situation. We have a credit system, so we're not subject to federal taxation per se. So this exemption in the short term wouldn't affect us as much, more in the midterm, I'd say, because the gains that we would achieve by way of exemptions, i.e. the carbon tax on farm fuels, will give us the same flexibility in Quebec. So that's why we're here today. We support a principle that has been just discussed at length. In other words, things need to be done in the right way, in a consistent way, in a useful way. And this isn't the case currently with a carbon tax being levied on propane. We are here to address that principle, and at the same time, in the same breath, when that will be recognised across Canada, well, then we'll try and use that model in Quebec when it comes to farm fuels that still aren't covered by the exemption.
Thank you.
Now, that cost, as I said earlier, is absolutely huge. For Quebec, for the average farm in Quebec, the carbon tax on propane costs between $4,000 and $5,000 per annum for a specialised farm producing soybeans and maize. Thank you, Mr. Legault. Oh, sorry to cut you off. Your time has run out, but thank you all the same. And thank you, Ms. Valdez. Mr. Parent, for 6 minutes, please. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Thanks to the witnesses. Mr. Legault, if you could just finish your last sentence, I'll give you that opportunity. Yes. Well, basically, I wanted to say that it costs between $4,000 and $5,000 on average. In 2030, it'll be $16,000 to $18,000. In terms of propane costs due to the carbon tax. Thank you very much. Mr. Legault, since we're talking, last time we studied a similar piece of legislation, we focused on grain drying and we came to the conclusion that there was no viable short-term alternative. Does the same apply for the heating of buildings, or are we closer to having alternatives in that realm? Well, I spoke to my sector. For livestock buildings, it's different, but for grain, well, it's very expensive. I know that this doesn't amount to the highest cost on farms when it comes to heating buildings for the production of grain. Now, the whole issue of drying of grain is that one needs very high capacity. So high capacity energy over the short haul. So one day, perhaps it will be possible to dry grain by way of electricity. We're a far cry from having that technology for the time being, but we need to have access to electrical currents, and in Quebec, in many areas, we don't have access to that kind of electricity. And we're talking here about a very high rate of electricity, and so technologically speaking, we're just not there when it comes to drying in other ways except for that particular fuel, propane and natural gas. Gentlemen, I'd like to hear your input on that issue. We have no alternatives when it comes to drying grain in the short term, but when it comes to heating buildings, do you believe that we are on the verge of having alternatives?
I can start. I think that when we look at heating or cooling buildings, we be very clear that this would be livestock buildings and greenhouses, that there's no intention, I think, in this legislation to talk about housing costs or housing heating, cooling of homes. Canada's a very big country. Infrastructure-wise, we simply, in many provinces, do not have alternatives outside of natural gas or propane. Electrification does work, but even most homes are still heated by natural gas and propane. So I think we are still a ways away to have an economically viable, scalable one alternative to natural gas and propane that would work across Canada as a whole, and this is federal legislation that we're discussing.
Okay. C'est bon? I would just add to that when we look at some of the technologies that were cited in the last panel, I would say this is not an either-or proposition. The intent of this bill and the value of it is it provides a working capital to farmers for those technologies that are available to invest in their operations and employ those, recognizing, as Dave said, the fundamental technology, there is not a viable, scalable alternative. So it supports continuous improvement while recognizing limitations in the market.
Merci. Monsieur Guénette.
Mr. Guénette. So we understand that there is no viable, scalable alternatives in the short order, but perhaps by way of research we'll find out about new innovations. But earlier you said you were more in favour of an exemption rather than a rebate, because rebates are more complicated and sometimes only partial, and we know what red tape is like in Canada and, well, everywhere else. I don't want to cast aspersions here, but how can you maintain the pricing signal with a view to reducing the carbon footprint? The idea of putting a price on solution is very important. So how do we avoid impacting this pricing signal in other ways than a sunset clause, for example? Well, let me take a stab at that, and perhaps my colleague, Ms. Taylor would like to tack on to my response. But when it comes to a sunset clause, well, we support that idea. And we alluded to a 10-year sunset clause, and we'd be in support of that if it will help with the passage of Bill C-234 and help farmers with the skyrocketing operating costs that they're currently coming to grips with. Fertilizers, energy costs, inputs of all sorts. Right now, they're rising costs, and we need to find a way to help our farmers come to grips with those rising costs. Now, when it comes to developing environmental habits, so to speak, farmers are among the greatest environmentalists out there. They earn their livelihood from working the land. My grandfather was a farmer as well, and farmers always look after their land. And I think all we need to do is give them the means to invest, to improve, to make capital improvements, for example, make enhancements to their facilities, any kind of improvement that may help environmentally. So we need to give them the means to invest in that manner, in those new technologies. That would be the best way, to my mind, of helping our farmers to further reduce their carbon footprint. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, well, thank you, Mr. Guinnett. Thank you, Mr. Perron. Your time has run out. Mr. McGregor, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. Mr. Carey and Mr. Ross, I think I'll start with you. We of course was talking a lot about C-234, but I also want to look at the parent statute, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act that it is seeking to amend. I was present in the 42nd Parliament when that statute became law. It was part of a Budget Implementation Act. When the Liberal government drafted that bill, they took the time to include definitions of qualifying farm fuel, of eligible farming activities, and of eligible farming machinery. Why do you think they took the time to include those provisions in the parent statute?
I don't want to speculate as to what the government's thinking was, but I think they wanted it to be sufficiently broad while appropriately narrow. And I think at that time, the biggest, I think, confusion that we had, or that now, was only gasoline and diesel was included as opposed to natural gas and propane. Scott?
Yeah, I think all I would add is that I view Bill C-234 as a natural sort of tidying up of that parent statute and what was intended in the first place when we look at the intention behind this bill.
I think there was an understanding there that for those particular fuel sources, there were no viable alternatives, and that farmers do require a lot of diesel to power their tractors. And I know there's promising technology being developed, but currently for the horsepower needed to be generated, there are no viable alternatives. I want to turn to this, to the current state of technology of grain drying in particular. We've heard a lot of talk about the BTUs that are necessary to be developed, and the problems that may exist with using biomass, for example. But farmers are an innovative bunch. We've got many people who are out there actively working to overcome the challenges. Have you heard from your members on what some of the promising technologies might be 10 years from now, and maybe how the federal government can step in to try and encourage that development?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly with when it comes to grain drying, in my day job, our 43,000 canola farmers would love if they could use electricity. It would be a cheaper alternative. And I think what Scott and I, and Scott alluded to, is that we're certainly not opposed to the transition to more energy efficient fuels on farm or renewable fuels. So electrification, certainly, it does speak to the earlier panel around what powers that electrification. But I think it speaks to, it's a massive discussion, a massive undertaking. We're talking about the infrastructure across Canada. We are a huge country that's swinging from mine minus 40 to plus 35 from winter to summer. And I think just deploying that. But there certainly are more energy efficient sort of tools that we're sort of interested in. But farmers currently are struggling the capital to invest in the technologies that exist now. If they need to find the capital to invest in the next wave of technologies, they need the working capital on farms so they're economically sustainable. But we are certainly not here to say that we don't want to help see that transition, but that transition will take time. In the meantime, we got a lot of food to grow here in Canada.
Absolutely. And, high fuel costs certainly are a driver. If you can find a way to employ a different energy source, that's a great thing. What are some of the biggest transitions that farmers have made over the last 10 years away from fossil fuels on their own, and just any success stories that you've witnessed?
Well, I would just say, generally speaking, the adoption of precision agricultural technologies and a massive progress in the number of times tractors are going over fields, combines are passing over fields, is, I think, the reduction in fuel use we've seen by precision agricultural technology, no-till technology to reduce the time you're spending in the field on equipment has been the most significant. And when it comes to livestock operations, I think there's been a continual evolution of heat exchangers being adopted, solar technologies and others employed to support in many instances, what is still the absolute requirement, which is fossil fuel heating and cooling as the core constituent of that. But I think we continue to see new technologies being employed.
I would just add to Scott's point, I think the key is there's no silver bullet here, right? And farmers need to have all the tools possible to deploy on farm. I think in early 90s, it was about 7% no-till or low-till in the prairies. Now we're up to the high 60s. But that was because of the introduction of herbicide-tolerant crops. So we look at biotechnology, gene editing, that's part of it. Food additives for the cattle industry that reduce methane emissions. So there's no one thing that's going to be that silver bullet, but we need that innovation and farmers continuing to invest in their operations, and to do that, it helps when you've got money left on the table at the end of the day.
More like silver buckshot. I guess my final question, I live in British Columbia, so this conversation that we're having is not going to really impact me. But I am curious because, BC is not known as a major grains producer, but we do have the Peace region, and I think there's roughly about 380,000 acres that are under grain production up in the Peace region. C206 made it to the doorstep of the Senate in the previous Parliament. If C234 goes the distance and we see this actual change to the federal legislation, what's your understanding of how that will impact provinces that don't fall under the federal, will that have some spin-off effects in BC?
So all I can say is I think the intention behind this is to demonstrate the benefits of a provision like this, and that the provinces ideally would be looking to what's working and what's helping incent adoption of technologies. And as Dave has just alluded to, there's very much a recognition that farmers having the working capital they need to invest in these kinds of technologies is really going to be critical for our ability to reduce our environmental footprint. So our expectation and hope would be that those provinces not in the backstop jurisdictions will look at what's working federally and employ similar provisions in their own respective pricing regimes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Mr. Carey and Mr. Ross. On a Monsieur Lehoux, mais je pense...
Mr. Lehoux, but it's my understanding you'll be sharing your time with Mr. Falk. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. That's correct. I'll be sharing my time with my colleague, Mr. Falk. Thank you very much, witnesses, for being with us this afternoon. My question is directed at Mr. Legault. You referred to 9,500 members of your association in Quebec. In the previous panel, folks told us that electricity might be an interesting option. How many farmers would potentially be able to access electricity? Because in order to achieve energy efficiency, you need a special kind of electricity, don't you? So have you a sense of how that would work for farmers in Quebec? Response. Well, yes, when it comes to drying grain, it would require a triphase electric charge. I'm not aware whether that actually would be enough or whether it would need to be even stronger than that in terms of wattage. And if you have 30 dryers on the same network, well, you'd have to be careful about power outages in the neighbouring farmhouses. So I'm not sure of what kind of wattage would be required. Thank you very much. You have basically told us, yes, this will be very difficult to apply.
You, and thank you to all our witnesses for coming. Just was going to talk to the Agriculture Carbon Alliance folks a little bit here. When the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was adopted, for whatever reason, there was a specific carve-out for agriculture for diesel and gas. I think it was a recognition of the importance that we as Canadians place on our food supply and our food chain, on agriculture, and the important work that farmers do. We know that for whatever reason there was an omission, whether it was intentional or whether it was inadvertent. But there's a sector of our farm community that was not included in that, and that includes the folks growing livestock and also the people irrigating their fields and drying their grain. I live in Manitoba. It gets to minus 35 below there. And I know as a broiler farmer, every 5 weeks he's emptying out his barn. And it sits empty. He washes it, he cleans it, he disinfects it, and he gets ready for the next batch. When those chicks come in there on day one, do you know the temperature that barn needs to be?
Assume it'd be sufficiently warm or cool.
95 degrees. It has to be 95 degrees for the first week. You've already addressed this, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Is there a fuel source other than propane or natural gas that can accomplish that in an efficient manner?
Not that is widely available or economically viable right now.
Okay. And I would like to think that our farmers are smart. I know lots of them, and I don't know of one farmer, at least in my riding, that unnecessarily spends money on fuel. And they're best practices producers, and I think your support of this bill is very admirable. So I look at the numbers that you've indicated here, and as a conglomeration here, you represent over 200,000 producers. I think that voice is loud and clear that this is a bill you want to see move forward. Have I interpreted that correctly?
Absolutely, and I could say the ACA is also the first time we've ever actually brought every segment of the agriculture primary production together. Supply management, export-oriented grains and oilseed, dairy, poultry, all are in support of this bill. It does have varying degrees of impact depending on which of those commodities you're in, but there's a recognition across every one of those organizations, that's included in our letter of support, that this is a key policy principle and a key tool for actual economic viability and environmental viability on farm. Yes.
I think I'm pretty much done here.
Yep, thank you very much, Mr. Falk. So we'll now turn, certainly no stranger to the Agriculture Committee and the Member of Parliament from Guelph, which we know has a lot of agriculture. Good to see Mr. Longfield on the committee, and you have 5 minutes, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and it's good to be back on Agri and a lot of familiar faces around the table as well. I wanted to start with Agriculture Carbon Alliance and possibly move on to the other witnesses, and thank you all for being here. I visited a farm in Listowel, not too far from Guelph, and on her farm, she's created some small business around taking oil seeds and creating a press, taking the oil from the seeds, and she's converted her diesel using an add-on to her injection system that she buys from Switzerland to create electricity using the biodiesel that she gets from the oil seeds. She takes the dry seeds and she calls them Nutri-Grain bars for cattle, a very high protein, high density feed for cattle. And then she also uses the oil to feed boilers, and she also takes some of her hydraulic oil and other oil to heat the barns. So she created a business around making her farm more sustainable and now is selling those solutions to other farms around her. Have you looked at the small business opportunities that pricing signals give the market?
So I guess I can't speak to that specific technology or that specific example, but what I would say is in considering that story, I think one of the important kind of elements when I hear that is I think many of those investments were probably made a number of years ago, setting and staged that plan. And I would suggest that from our perspective, when you look at fuel prices right now and where they reside for farmers on diesel, whatever it may be, I mean, that is the number one concern we hear about from our farmers every day, and I think those business opportunities would exist in the absence of that specific carbon pricing signal in these areas, because there is still an absolute need to reduce fuel use wherever possible.
I mean, the company's name is Energrow. You can look them up, Energrow. But then into the larger, I'm wondering whether your association works in other countries or has associations with other associations in other countries that have had high fuel costs, higher than North America. I'm looking at the Ryla stationary dryer system from Germany. It's to scale. It's 120 tons per hour for grain, 4% moisture removal, up to 18 tons per hour for maize, 20% moisture removal. It's a scaled system that looks like it could be put on any feedlot, any silo system anywhere in Canada. Germany seems to have some technology they've developed where I've heard the argument today that there are no other technologies out there, and they're using biofuels to do the drying. There's another one in England, Alvin Blanche from the UK, that's using an airflow systems that was mentioned in the last panel. And then in Saskatchewan, we've got ASSI dry air grain drying that's using finished alfalfa pellets for 7 to 10 metric tons per hour, a little bit less volume, but still viable for many farms. How do we tie the innovations happening in other countries into Canadian innovations that could then look at the price signals that the market is getting, saying there's actually an economic opportunity here?
I think those are excellent examples of like where we are going, and the example in Listowel is a great example of what works for your farm works for your farm. I would suspect that farm is not a major size acreage wise.
A lot of farms around here, and they're 200-acre farms. I mean, in Ontario, I'm from Manitoba, so I know that 10,000 acres aren't uncommon on the prairies.
Well, and it's fantastic to hear about this technology. I would hope that if it was viable for Canada, that the wait list wouldn't be too long, because currently farmers can't buy new technology because there's no supply of it. But the one thing I would suggest is that in Canada, most farmers who have a grain dryer have already done as many upgrades as they possibly can, and we saw $50 million announced for grain dryers. There's approximately 50,000 grain dryers across Canada. Average grain dryer is $100,000 pre-cement in the prairies, so that's about 500 grain dryers that entire thing could do. So there's also just a lot of infrastructure already in place. So to invest that, for farmers to invest in that, they need the money in their hands to do it, or support from government. But there's also, I think, no one size fits all, where if these work for your farm, farmers will go that if they have the economic means to do so.
But we have capital cost allowances for people that are investing in clean technologies. We do have other programs that are available. And when I hear numbers like that, I just see opportunity in terms of helping the farmers as well as helping Canadian business. Back over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Longfield. Thank you, Mr. Carey and Mr. Ross. Maintenant, Monsieur Perron, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Mr. Perron, 2.5 minutes. Then Mr. McGregor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to turn back to you, Mr. Gannett. Would the exemption for building heating, is it as important as the exemption for grain drying? Taylor, would you like to respond to that question?
Holly Taylor, if she can answer the question.
For sure, if English is okay. I think they're both absolutely necessary for farmers, especially right now. We've heard, they need this really, really badly. And so, of course, we need that grain drying focus. I hear every single day from farmers that are so stressed and angry that, they're asking me what's going on with this bill, when is this going to pass, etc. So I think, the primary focus is kind of on grain drying as we are in the season, but definitely heating of buildings is very important.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Dave or Scott, on the same question, is building heating as important an exemption as grain drying exemptions are?
I would say, it's not an easy question to answer, in that if you talk to a livestock farmer, they're competing with other livestock farmers around the world, and they are in global markets, and competitiveness is front and center just as much as it is to a grain operation. So for both of those industries, this is a critical issue for them. And I think the reality of this is, in many instances, our producers are competing in markets with jurisdictions that don't have a carbon pricing pressure on their competitiveness and profitability. So when engaging our members who span every one of those commodities referenced in our membership, it's a critical issue for all of them in their own respective areas.
Well, at the previous with the previous panel, I asked this question: how do we maintain a pricing signal with a view to reducing our carbon footprint? How do we maintain that signal?
The pricing signal is there, and just to be clear that even if 234 was passed, farmers are not made whole from carbon pricing. The second carbon pricing goes up every year. The cost of custom haul trucking, freight, their inputs, the rest of their day-to-day goes up. We're simply asking for an exemption for on-farm food production. So the pricing signal we feel is already there. Farmers are not using inputs unless they have to. It is simply too expensive. The cost that we feel as suburban or urban Canadians is nothing compared to what a 6,000-acre farm in Saskatchewan faces. So the price signal philosophically are very important for this regime. Farmers are already facing that, and this is just about food production, not the rest of their lives outside of just the primary food production on farm.
Merci, Monsieur Carey, Monsieur Parent, Monsieur McGregor.
Mr. McGregor, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, I just kind of want to go on the same line of questioning. So, one of the big differences between C234 and the previous C206 is this addition of a new clause under the definition of eligible farm machinery. Just reading it out, it would be a new B.1, which reads, property used for the purpose of providing heating or cooling to a building or similar structure, including those used for the raising or housing of livestock. I guess when I first read this, it seems to be fairly vague. You had mentioned earlier, I think, Mr. Carey, about you definitely want to see greenhouses and livestock mentioned. Do you think the wording could be tightened up a little bit in this particular section?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but it's certainly the greenhouses already have an 80% exemption currently. Yeah. So the parent legislation you referred to earlier certainly already is there. Yeah. I would certainly defer to the lawyers and drafters, but I think the intention of the bill being a building that heats or cools livestock or greenhouses, so long as that is there, then I certainly wouldn't want to get overly prescriptive with the committee. We did hear the last iteration on 206 CRA say it was too broad and too vague. So I believe the intention of this bill was actually to be more specific, with also just recognizing what you might call a building or something in one province might differ from the other. But
just quickly, I don't have a lot of time. So, if we are going to keep this in, there have been some suggestions about tightening up the language, putting in a sunset clause for it. Do you think that farmers could be meeting us halfway? Like, if we're going to provide them some relief on the cost, do you think also there should be some better investment incentives to make their buildings more efficient, right? If we're going to give them a break on the cost of energy costs, there should also be a quid pro quo here in trying to make the energy loss, as little as possible.
Yeah, I think within the scope of a PMB, they can only ponder one act, but I would suggest that certainly putting a sunset clause would be appropriate. I would caution the committee around being overly, I'd say, draconian about that. If it's 10 years, I think that is appropriate. But you could add an order on council provision to allow the government of the day to make the right decision. Do you sunset it? Do you extend it? Do you rescind it? Whatever it might be based on where it is. What I wouldn't want to see is for this committee and our predecessors 10 years down the road to be having the same conversation around on-farm. But I believe absolutely to your point that it would require additional legislation, governmental programs, and funding to incentivize that and further investment. But I believe a PMB is fairly kind of surgical and narrow in scope.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses, to Mr. Carey, Mr. Ross, Mr. Guinette, Madame Brown, and Monsieur Legault. Thank you very much for providing important testimony today on Bill C-234. Colleagues, just before we break, I want to give you a bit of an update in terms of what we're planning to do on Wednesday. We do have 3 individuals that have been confirmed. My apologies. Let me find them right here. We have Ghislaine Gervais, who is the president of the Solio Group. Dennis Prose, who is the VP of Government Affairs with CropLife Canada, and Mark Thompson, the Executive VP of Nutrien, all of whom have confirmed. Now, it is no secret that Mr. McGregor has certainly introduced the concept of a new study. Mr. Parent has given us notice of a particular motion that he might like to move, and Mr. Liu would like to be able to move a motion as it relates to Minister Fraser in this committee. And so I've asked those three gentlemen not to move their motion today so that we didn't have to disrupt this meeting. But we are going to set aside 1 hour on Wednesday. It will be in public forum. If the committee chooses to move in camera, that's their choice, but it will start as a public meeting to discuss those motions. It'll be committee business so that we can deal with those without disrupting the rest of our pre-program schedule for the benefit of our witnesses. So, colleagues, that's just a sense of what's going to be happening. We will let you know whether or not the witnesses will be the first hour or the second. Our desire is to have them in the first hour so that we can move to committee business in the second to discuss the motions that are intended to be moved at that time. Okay? Okay. Thank you, everyone.